Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson, and a Happy New Year to all of our listeners. This week, I was pleased to welcome back to the studio Jim Aidala, Senior Government Affairs Consultant at BNC and its consulting affiliate, the ACTA Group, to discuss his take on what to expect from EPA and Congress on pesticide matters in the new year. As a keen observer of EPA chemical policies and personalities, hearing Jim's observations is always informative. As many of you know, Jim is a former assistant administrator of what is now the EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. And Jim is a lifelong student of chemical governance, particularly on pesticides. We discuss EPA administrative issues, the legislative forecast, MAHA, and other topics of interest to our listeners. Now, here's my conversation with Jim Aidala. Jim, welcome back to the studio. I've been looking forward to hearing your observations on what to expect this year in Congress and at EPA. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure. And this is a part of a new experiment. If our audience doesn't know, this is a podcast with video. I think they got a term for that somewhere. I'm not sure what it is, but go ahead.
I'll count on you to invent one.
That's right.
But as our listeners should be aware, or I hope they are aware, many of the comments and questions and issues that we're going to discuss in this podcast are explained in greater detail in our 2026 forecast, which is on our website. This 119-page document is our expression of love to our clients and interested others. So just want to make sure that people know that it's out there and available, and urge you to take a look. So with that, Jim, let's get on to our discussion.
Sure. Well, I put even more of a plug for the forecast, though, Lynn, because it's not just, yes, our brilliant insights, and they were pretty good. We're a pretty smart bunch. It's especially good just as a record of the documentation of all the things we talk about. So even if you could disagree with us, it's got an incredible number of hot links. I use it as a reference document, before and after.
Yeah.
I can go back to a couple of years ago, and the links themselves are worth what it costs, which is free. It makes it even better. So.
Good point. Thank you for that, Jim. Well, as we record this podcast, we are just shy of the beginning of year 2 of Trump 2.0. And so before we get into any of the particulars that I know we're going to cover, what are your general quick impressions?
Well, is it crazier than expected? That's hard to tell. It's obviously shock and awe. Generally speaking, from the administration for our particular audience and our issues for EPA comes out better than a lot of other agencies. Number one,
Yep.
This crowd did hit the ground running, very much so. It took, for example, in our space, especially a program we really follow is chemical and pesticides, and there they didn't have a confirmed assistant administrator for literally 2 years into the first term, and so. They had acting people there in the first days. They had some other appointees come in pretty early. They now have a confirmed AA. And all that is progress. And that's some of what they learned from the first time around. And Project 2025, it's a bit of a template, less, I think, for this program, certainly for pesticides and chemicals, but especially even EPA-wide. Yeah, climate and diversity and other kinds of things, that isn't news that those were affected. But basically, other than that, the agency's relatively carrying on. I won't say unaffected at all. It's been very affected. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But it's just carrying on most of the other program work.
Well, and I think we have been fortunate that the leadership in OCSPP in particular is an experienced bunch. Dr. Beck, Dr. DeCleva, and others throughout leadership positions in OCSPP are very good and very experienced people. So there was really no, cessation or misstep. It was a smooth transition, and we have been beneficiaries of experience and competent, well-executed plans to carry out the agenda that the Trump administration seeks to implement.
Well,
like it or not, that people
well, exactly. And yeah,
they're
as
doing what they're doing.
you kind of point out that both, Nancy Beck and Lynn DeClava they're
Hmm.
recidivists. I mean, they're there for the first term. So obviously, it's good to see some people still like government service, but after some of the other things that happen, I think that's recruitment and public service, maybe something we talk about a little bit later.
Right. Well, Jim, you mentioned Project 2025, which some people speculated, was a roadmap for what actually happened in 2025. Do you see any signs, or are there any indications of what to expect in the new year, this 2026, election year? What can be discerned from a review of Project 2025?
Well, it depends on what part of Project 2025, right? So the IRIS program and ORD was, shall we say, more than a little bit affected. I mean, ORD was quote reorganized, and then you've got ORD basically being just a real sort of administrative function, administering grants and some other things. But the IRIS program was greatly affected insofar as it basically was disbanded. What's interesting is what's going to happen now, because you're going to have to invent something, because the idea of Iris is a foundationally strong one and
Right.
obvious, which is, one way to assess a chemical that would be applying to all the media programs. It had a lot of controversies. That's a whole separate discussion. But then whether it's consistent with the way programs should or do actual risk assessments that have to rely on it to actually implement a regulatory program, that is, I think, a source of some of the controversies and problems. But risk assessment itself is certainly a foundational issue for a lot of the work of EPA, and certainly for chemicals and pesticides.
Hmm. Agree. Well, to my eye, and our listeners may disagree, you may disagree, but the first year of Trump 2.0 seemed just especially chaotic, and not because of the subject matter in which we engage, but rather against the backdrop of Doge and the newness of the cabinet and some of the decisions and rollbacks that we experienced over the past almost 12 months now. But is it your take, number one, does that reflect your view? And number two, has it settled down at all? Or do you expect it to do so?
Well, it's settled down a little bit just because we know a little more about what to expect. Good
True.
news, bad news of a sort, again, depending on your view. I would say that the Doge activity, even though Doge itself is, I think it's gone, but it's not clear. There's still people, if they don't have a literal chainsaw waving around, they probably have some hypothetical ones in mind. And so that will have a long-term impact, in my opinion, about recruiting and just being a Fed, the terms of federal service, because security was foundational, again, to that concept of why you might want to become a federal employee.
Right.
How do you go to a recruit? We did a blog item on this, right? It'll be, and
Yeah,
it's
no, we did. Yeah, I remember that.
cited in the forecast, but I mean, it's, how do you go to a recruitment fair and say, hey, join government service? It's really swell. And by the way, some of the people that maybe your bosses really don't like federal employees. I mean, that kind of thing. And whether that's true or not, that they quote don't like the employees, it certainly seems that way, given some of the, as you put it, chaos and other kinds of tumult that happened in the past year. So will it quiet down? Sure, it will to some extent, just because even if it happens in some lesser way, it's not a stunning surprise as much as it was in the first days of 2025.
Hmm. Well, you alluded to morale, recognizing that a lot of offices have diminished staff, and I know OCSPP in particular has not really taken a substantial hit on the number of employees devoted to the areas in which they are entrusted because of ORD migration. Scientists that had been at ORD are now over at OCSPP. So there's a lot of moving parts, but recognizing that there was a lot of attrition, a lot of people took voluntary retirement or voluntary resignations. How has that affected morale? Is it better than it had been the last time we talked about this, and where do you see it going in this new year?
Well, in the sense of EPA wide, and this comes from the EPA Alumni Network. I'm a proud
Right.
member of that. Obviously, we can read the Environmental Protection Network, which is mostly a lot of EPA alum that are in a little more in the activist camp, including some of the friends that we know, certainly good friends of the firm that are now retired and things like that. But the bottom line being that, yeah, morale is pretty bad. Everything from even if you have a job, what are the prospects? The first Trump administration and this one has continued the sort of a real firewall between the political people and the career people. It's not that as a political person, I was one of those years ago, that you let everybody in and all the really good stuff, the really secrets. First of all, there aren't as many secrets as people think, but there are some because you are
Hmm.
in charge. The political team is in charge of the beast. So that does make a difference. But again, that sort of morale building attitude, if you will, and real or imagined, that's a real problem for the current team. And especially, I don't work in climate. I work in pesticides. Pesticides has relatively been unchanged. Toxics has seen a little more change just because of the changes in assessment that were done over the previous couple of years, and now they're being changed again to whatever extent. Again, separately, we may talk about some of that. But the point is that those changes are non-trivial. And again, the long-term effect, there's been a lot of brain drain in light of those retirements.
Yeah,
Some
that's
voluntary, some maybe not so voluntary, whatever it was. Getting rid of all the temporary employees, the so-called probationary employees. Well, that by definition were the new people coming in to replace jobs that were open, right? To
all right.
replace positions and things. So even if you start out with being able to recruit and being successful in recruiting, you then have to train those people. First of all, if nothing else, they're all rookies by definition. And secondly, you've got problems because they're not, you did lose years and years and years of institutional knowledge. And in some ways, that can be a good thing. And other times, it can be you got to train the person of, yeah, there's where that this is the way we put the pink paper behind the blue paper, and here's why. It may sound dumb, but here's why, and
All
things like
right.
that.
Recognizing that morale could be improved, my own personal view is talking with a lot of the folks that I do at EPA. I think there is strong appreciation for leadership at EPA is hugely protective and supportive of their people, but working in an institution that has lost so much can be a bit of a downer. In addition to just the difficulties of having that kind of morale issue undermine opportunities to recruit. And I don't know if there is a hiring freeze now, Jim, or not in either pesticides or toxics. But not being able to bring in as many people as we wish, and people that are brought in may or may not be happy once they get there. What are some of the other, perhaps longer term impacts on the federal workforce? You've spoken in other contexts about RIF procedures. What is that about?
Well, right. I mean, that's an example of, again, the longer term prospects, not just recruitment, but even how to implement your changes.
Hmm.
Elections have consequences. Leadership can decide to change a program or do more of this and less of that. Those are what happens. But everything from the clawbacks, which get into other issues, you asked earlier about longer term effects, it was a shock and awe kind of thing. But that'll be, it may not be so surprising this year, but how much of do you have allocated monies that's appropriated, which arguably it's illegal, right, to then not spend that money for that purpose. And the courts haven't decided on all those things. I mean,
Right.
there's a massive amount of litigation on things like those kind of clawbacks, or whether you can eliminate an entire program or an entire agency. Again, EPA is not in that bucket, but if you worked at USAID, do I still have a job? I just read today in the Post about how it looks like Voice of America, Congress may still be insisting on having a bigger Voice of America program. Now, again, that could be even a Congress, with this Congress, both houses approved it. The president could veto it if he felt that way. Then you have an it's not like
Hmm.
it's a done deal, but that's another sign of some further tumult about so if you're at VOA, do I have a job? Will I have a job? Should I keep this job? If I'm any good, do I go and leave this job? And that could
Yeah.
be applying to all kinds of positions across the government. Your question about riffing, riff is a very arcane,
Yeah.
bizarre world. For those of the listening audience that know even think they have a clue in the pesticide space about what a treated article is, it makes treated articles sound very straightforward and easy. Um, and think about your shower curtain and what pesticides on it, maybe, and your head will start to throb a little, and then you'll understand maybe why treated articles is a weird issue. Anyway, but for riffing procedures, reductions in force, you could end up with people who were in one of these programs that was eliminated. Let's just
Hmm.
take the diversity office. And that could be someone who was there and they were able employee, not controversial, not with an agenda, whatever. You can characterize it any way you like. But then they've got experience in the water program. But their official job designation is an environmental protection specialist. And there's lots and lots of people who, funny thing, are called environmental protection specialists. Well, then that person might be one, or if they're a scientist, they
Hmm.
were doing science stuff in the water program for years, moved over to these kind of diversity programs and other things, and that person, because of the riffing procedures, they may bump somebody who you've come to know and love, and finally got trained well in pesticides. It was a 6-year employee in pesticides, but they're a 12-year employee in the water program before they went over to the diversity office. They could bump somebody in pesticides who's finally learned how to do the eco assessment or the
Right.
health, whatever, some part of the pesticide application world, bump because they've got seniority rights and other designations under the RIF procedures. And again, riffing is not done commonly, but again, if you're going to do these wholesale changes to the federal workforce, you have to follow those procedures.
Well, I think you're right. Treated articles are probably a little more coherent than riffing procedures. Are there other unintended tended consequences that you envision, given all the tumult that has been going on for the past 11 and a half months?
Well, again, I harp on recruitment just because I've got two
Yeah.
relatively young sons because they're looking to what jobs they want to, what careers do they want in the workforce. And, what I tell especially my one son's interested in policy and things. And he's a geologist, but he's a very good geologist and he's very politically oriented. Would you say,
I
well,
wonder
go
why
for
that is, Jim.
yeah, well, somehow that happened. But anyway, and very detailed, mindful of a lot of trivial things in the geology space. Anyway, but they can both do
Mm.
pesticide issues if they put their mind to it. Ever since you asked, both boys, since about the age of 8, have been able to identify a pesticide false claim and watching a cleaning product commercial. Anyway,
Making dad so proud.
yes. Anyway, but the other kinds of unintended consequences. Well, you've got everything from, again, long-term effects. What's this program going to be looking like? Morale does matter.
Yeah, of course
What
it
kind of
does.
deregulation agenda? Again, presidents have, right? President, when they win an election, have consequences. A deregulation agenda, back to Project 2025, and not surprisingly for this administration. Well, what's that mean in this space? If you
Mhm.
deregulate, one of the things early on, if you issue a regulation, you're going to take 10 regulations off. Well, a tolerance for a pesticide is done by regulation. So for every tolerance you hope to get from EPA, are they going to deregulate, meaning get rid of 10 other tolerances? I don't think so, because the growers that depend on those 10 products and the companies that put all that work in are going to be a little grumpy. So what's the deregulation agenda mean for this team, even though, yes, that's a rhetorical goal, a good goal from a certain point of view and all that. But how's that apply in this space? And those are some of the things that will unfold in the second, third, and fourth year of the term, right?
Right,
Because
right.
in the first year, you don't need to. I think we have the count. The more executive orders in this first year than anybody before. Mr. Trump
By far,
he
right.
likes to have I'm the number one thing or whatever else, et cetera. And he certainly has that trophy for the most executive orders in the first year.
Just, kind of overall, how would you evaluate the EPA leadership team and their activities to date? I think we were all surprised when, Representative Zeldin was selected as early on as he was to be EPA administrator. As you correctly noted, we now have an EPA assistant administrator for toxics, Doug Troutman, and Nancy Beck, Linda Clever were in leadership positions very early on, all of which I think has benefited the regulated community, not necessarily because we're all on the same page, but rather having a competent, experienced team, is comforting. But beyond that, how would you or do you think a third-party independent person would evaluate EPA's performance to date?
Well, trying to separate out your point of view kind of thing,
Mhm,
not of you, but of one observer, as you say. If you're interested in climate programs, and you're obviously more than disappointed, right? It's been pretty much obliterated. Um, and if you sort of supported the very conservative views, scientifically speaking, of the IRIS program and agreed with that, not just supported it, you agreed with it in your
mhm.
for whatever space and whatever reasons, um, then yeah, you're very disappointed. That's both of those not coming back soon. Um, in terms of Mr. Zeldin and the team, and now Troutman and the leadership team there, the political leadership team. No, they do have experience in their spaces. I'm not sure every AA for EPA. Some have more experience, and DAA on all the team, the senior
Mhm.
team, all have as much experience as OCSPP. That's good for our client base and the work we do. Good insofar as understanding the issues, understanding what you're going to say. Again, people can
Right.
disagree with the outcomes, but it's a difference in some other parts of the agency, as I understand it. And then you still have, again, priorities and things. If you really don't want to spend money on Superfund cleanups, that's you're going to have a different sort of opinion about things versus or gee, we want Superfund cleanups, but we really don't like the Superfund tax that pays for the cleanups. So therefore, we're not going to, we're going to strangle some of the money over time. So, and again, it's a larger issue, not just EPA, but something else I point out for people that haven't been part of the federal workforce, and especially in any kind of leadership position of any stripe, which is when you've got a kind of even a flat budget, and you may feel very successful that your budget was flat, not cut. That's great, but then a cola of 3 or 5% a year times do the math, 5 years, 10 years. Well, that's a 30% cut over that period of time, and
Mhm.
then you wonder why there's not as much work getting done. And so I know that the pesticide program has talked about a lot of that at their public meetings, PPDC meetings, the FACA, the pesticide FACA, PPDC, Pesticide Policy Dialogue Committee,
Mhm.
has these briefings every time. It's one of the places to go on the website for good information. But you see the decline in pesticide staffing over the years. And not just because, gee, the bolus of work for the first phases of FQPA, completing that, and the three tranches under FQPA way back when, the 15-year cycle now that we're in registration review, we're in the middle of, or towards the end of, since that's now the next deadline is now this October in 2026. There's an issue there we may want to talk about. And so you've got just all this work and all this again back it's morale, it's support, it's relationships between leadership and the staff, it's brain drain. All those things are coming together, and will have an impact long after this these next 3 years.
I'd like to take our conversation in two different directions. The first one being, what can we expect from Congress this year on, in particular, pesticide and chemical issues, and then have a more detailed discussion about the influence of MAHA and some of the tensions that we in this community experience between OCSPP and MAHA objectives. But it's an election year. This Congress has been uniquely dysfunctional at many levels. That's not a criticism, it's kind of a statement of fact. So, is it reasonable to expect anything in what we do, Jim, coming out of Congress this year? And what influence will the midterm elections have on any meaningful legislative agenda?
Well, 3 or 5 things, right? So first
Hmm.
on the midterm election cycle is in full swing, right? Everyone's talking about whether the House might flip, gee, or how many Senate seats might be in play, and all that kind of favorite, you know, um, party talk in Washington. I had a friend who once told me in New York, we just talk about real estate. In Washington, all you guys want to do is talk about politics
How
all
many
the time.
seats are open? Right.
Yeah, right. So, versus, yeah, who's got a good apartment that just came up because somebody died in the apartment building anyway. But the upshot is that Congress is still going to be stymied. You'll start to see more stunts by the leadership wanting to put a hard vote, the minority party, i.e., the Democrats, wanting to force a hard vote on some things to get other people, the other side on record, whether it be about healthcare subsidies or immigration or what have you.
Right.
Um, and that is going to be starting already. Number one, I don't know about you, I get 57 texts a day from somebody running for office, and as soon as you contribute, even if you contribute to a pretty neutral type candidate or a pretty centrist candidate, doesn't matter. You're on some list, and get deluged by
Yep.
requests. Um, and so that will all be happening again to the extent it even hasn't already. In the House, right, there's a few flickers of some changes from the absolute uniformity of the party base on the Republican side because you've got, the recent House vote on health care subsidies,
Right.
17 representatives and Republican representatives voted with the Democrats. There's some early movement, if you will, for war powers resolution after what happened in South America. And who knows what happens if we start to invade Greenland or get serious about it and all that about what the Senate may think about that idea, let alone that, if that happens as an action. Um, for more narrowly for chemicals and pesticides, there are some things that need to get done at some level.
Hmm.
The TSCA authorization for fees is expiring, so that was some people were originally hoping that would perhaps include certainly not just reauthorization, but provide an opportunity for some reforms to the TSCA program as mandated by Congress, some clarification there instead of the deluge of litigation. The separately, again, back to our forecast document, the articulation of all the pending litigation on the TSCA side
Yeah, there's a
is
lot.
long.
And it won't stop, right? And it's going to continue, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And even if Congress were to amend TSCA, which my own view is aspirationally, I wish it would, because there are areas that need clarification. Um, but given the polarization of the parties and the dysfunctionality of that particular body of government, I'm not hopeful.
Well, right, and in pesticides, PREA doesn't expire. The fee authorization in pesticides,
Right.
PREA, doesn't expire till 27.
2027.
The industry would like to see it happen in 26. Partly because there's some reforms to capture. Number one, number two, to get it off what people ordinarily might think is the farm bill cycle.
Mhm.
Although the farm bill cycle has gone awry because farm bill in the last 2 years has just been punted by sort of simple 1 year reauthorizations. But that raises what might have to get done. Well, the farm bill will have to be just once again punted, even if you assume Congress isn't doing anything much this year. But then, if that happens, is farm bill going to be something that could happen? There's some talk that could happen early. If I think the conventional wisdom I've heard usually is if things don't happen by March, certainly April, by the Easter break, after the Easter break, everything is partisan and looking at the election and all that. Doesn't mean nothing gets done, but just simply anything that does get done has that lens. Look at it through those lenses of the midterms. And so, can a farm bill get done? Even a quote simple, if there is such a thing, it's like again simple treated article question or something. But a simple farm bill nowadays get authorized, reauthorized, if you will, sometime in the next few months. It's possible. And then, of course, there's people, anytime there's any legislation, because there's so few pieces of legislation, substantive in any sense, legislation moving, then people try to put other things onto it. Like, do I want to include clarification of fill in the blank? You mentioned potential clarifications that are arguably needed. It's very supportable under
Mhm.
TSCA. or at least have the debate. Let's have an open, let's have that
Well,
discussion, and see what happens.
exactly. Discussion and airing divergent views is always important. It just seems that there are not a lot of opportunities for that to happen. There probably will be some hearings in the spring if there's some sort of consensus document that is agreed upon. But again, it would be nice to entertain legislative amendments to a very complicated law now that we have 10 years of experience with it. It's not an indictment of the original law. It's just like any new legislation, particularly complicated scientific legislation or legislation that invites a lot of scientific analysis. It isn't unusual to have mid-course corrections, but I get the sense that EPA writ large institutionally is not a fan. The environmental non-government organization community is definitely not a fan and have made their opposition to legislative amendments very, very clear. So that puts an enormous strain on industry and other advocates that wish to make some mid-course corrections make that happen between now and, given your calendar, basically spring.
Well,
So
right.
it just, but there may well be hearings, which would be good. Discussion is good, and just trying to achieve clarity on some of these issues would be good.
Well, last comment. I mean, in the current context, too, divergent open discussion means I hate you, no, I hate you more. I mean, that's not exactly the constructive, even,
It's not
regard.
exactly what I had in mind,
Well,
right?
no, but am I talking about chemical legislation, pesticide legislation, immigration, healthcare? What am I talking about? That's kind of
Yeah,
the tone underneath anything. And that becomes a bit of a problem because so what are the issues? Because seeking clarity on some of the issues you're basically talking about some issues in Tosca, certainly in pesticides, one person's process improvements to make the registration process more
yeah,
efficient is someone else's loopholes. Okay,
right.
in another time and place, let's talk about that because I'm not really seeking a loop. I know I'm really just seeking efficiency, not loophole. How do I deal with your concern that that's a loophole? Okay. But again, in the current context, it's no, I don't like your idea and I don't like your idea. Now, what was your idea? So,
Right. I'm a fan of conversation and discussion. Well, last topic, let's pivot to Make America Healthy Again. Secretary
indeed, let's make America healthy. Next.
we could all agree on making it healthy, right? But
See, we're
how
agreeing
one
already. Lynn, we're agreeing. Anyway,
how
go
one
on.
defines health is, of course, the $64,000 question. So, why don't you give me a couple of your thoughts on Maha, Senator Kennedy's or Secretary Kennedy's leadership and what's going on at HHS right now and its interface with the EPA?
Well, two comments. The first comment is just what was interesting was the first draft of the draft Maha statement, which I think was May of last year, was
Right.
really the classic Maha critique. I mean, it was, big ag, big food, big pharma. Um, we're really hurting America, and kids aren't getting enough exercise. They're looking at their screens too much. Everyone is manipulated. Government's co-opted. That was a clear theme mentioned explicitly in a bunch of places. And so then you have a pretty dismal picture of right what's going on, and that's why we need these fundamental reforms. And then the final report that came out in September had tucked the horns in on a lot of the sort of more thorny,
Hmm.
kind of critique of the various institutions. And for chemicals and pesticides in particular, it was, pesticides and your food, not just because it's over processed, quote unquote, ultra processed. I'm sorry, I'm still not sure what that means. I think it's something we'll define ultra processed food as soon as we figure out what PFAS means, but I'm not trying to mix chemicals up. Or
We get the gist there.
mix issues up. But anyway, but the upshot there. Okay, so what happened in the final report? It was we have a robust regulatory practice, supporting pesticide, making sure pesticides are safe and effective. And so all those statements along the way are true. But the point there was it was really upsetting to the shall we say, the hardcore Maha types that pesticides seem to have a pass. And I'm not sure they altogether did, but certainly compared to the tone in the draft in May, compared to
No, it
September.
was a decided
And then there's,
difference, right?
some press coverage, and the agricultural institutions, including pesticide industries, just as part of that community, but especially the farm groups, were pretty active in trying to point out that farmers need pesticides, and pesticides they do have a pretty strong regulatory system. Again, everything from individual chemicals to individual, policies can be debated. But now you've got more of a pushback from the community, especially what's called in the Maha movement, the Maha moms. The um, it's not exactly the same as when Meryl Streep had the Mothers and Others Against Pesticides back in many years ago, after about 30 years ago or so after Alar.
Hmm.
But it's a similar thing insofar as it's a real critique of the pesticide industry and just generally just pesticides. And with they have some particular ones they want to complain about. My snarky side was always saying that one problem for some pesticides is they are very pronounceable, and they then seem to attract more attention if they're pronounceable versus multisyllabic chemical type names. But that's a separate podcast on chemical naming. Anyway, but the impact has been that there's more of a pushback, and it's not clear where all that's going to go because, yeah, pesticides are needed. Pesticides have issues. That part's not new, but there's this interesting new alliance in the modern era, meaning in the last few years, under Trump's administration leadership right now, where you've got the hardcore anti-pesticide, so-called anti-pesticide, severe
Hmm.
pesticide critics from the left, joining up with some of the critics of pesticides and the way they're regulated or insufficiently regulated and so forth on the right. So you've got a different coalition, pressing for change compared to some, previous time.
Right.
And that's different. Where that's all going to go is certainly unclear. One place it has gone, though, for sure, is in various states. Some of the most aggressive MAHA activity has been in red states. And in
Hmm.
fact, the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has a website, a web page that's devoted entirely to MAHA actions in
States,
states,
yeah.
and it's 15 pages long on the web right now. And so you see this proposal in this state, this one in that state, wherever. Again, especially in red states, not only in red states, but especially in red states, so-called. And you got actions on school lunch programs. You got actions on SNAP benefits, whether people should be allowed to buy certain things with federal support for their feeding programs, what kind of school lunch, advice, or school lunch menus and things. And it's not like the previous administrations haven't been active on, for example, the school lunch menu, but this one is taking that MAHA agenda and trying to implement it again through these other
Hmm.
avenues in addition to federal, pushing of what's happening, at the secretary level. You say with Mr. Kennedy and his leadership. For the first year, obviously, to my eye, he's emphasized vaccines, and now dietary guidelines
Dietary,
just came
yeah.
out. Um, and whether the turn will be further to fill in the blank again is the original agenda. I draw your attention to the May draft. Will it be more big pharma and criticism of the pharmaceutical industry, not just vaccines? Will it be more food products and food production, meaning either A, pesticides as part of production, or even just food processing? Again, one of the sort of broad terms of food processing, most food is processed to some extent. That's how it gets to you. It's
Right.
washed, it's packed, it's whatever. But with what? That's different than saying it. You've added all these speaking of unpronounceable chemicals, added all these unpronounceable chemicals as part of the additives, and that seems to give people pause.
Well, I think it's going to be a consequential year in a lot of respects, at HHS, FDA, generally recognized as safe, PFAS, fluoride regulation. There's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, all of which we touch upon, if not spend a lot of time addressing in our forecast. So Jim, you've done a superb job of synthesizing a lot of the discussion in our forecast document. As I said, it's about 119 pages. There's a lot that we try to pack in, and it's not limited to the United States, of course. We cover Europe, South and Central America, and Asia as well. So I want to thank you for joining me today in the studio, offering your thoughts, which are always insightful and entertaining. And do you want to leave our listeners with any last word on what to expect in 2026?
Well, I just you mentioned the breadth and depth of the forecast. I was asking when we're going to be starting to talk about Antarctica. But anyway, we want to be a seven. I think because I think Australia's pretty active in the pesticide space, but
Yes.
and that is relevant to what happens even in global trade issues and things with Argentina, Australia, America being some major exporters. Anyway, but no real last words other than stay tuned, sports fans.
Yeah.
It will be an entertaining year.
Well, thanks again, Jim. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Jim Aidala for speaking with me today about what to expect in 2026 on pesticide matters. Our conversation confirms that 2026 will be as interesting as it is unpredictable. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.